Hello everybody and welcome back to my Megabase tutorial series, episode 4 here I believe. And it has been some time since I did the previous episode. I do want to start off by apologizing for that. I've been absolutely swamped and busy and very tired and just haven't had a chance to get around to doing this one. But we are finally here, and in today's episode there's two main topics I want to cover. One of them is build design, and the other one is spacing. Now, there's kind of some subtopics within spacing. There's spacing within a build, which kind of falls in build design, but then there's spacing between builds, and both of which I think are very important. Potentially, the spacing between builds would actually be the most important one, but we'll kind of showcase that a little later here. So let's start off by build design. Now, I have a map I've set up here. Spent a little time setting this up, and there's several designs. I haven't done every item, of course. I just set up a belt-based version of smelting, iron smelting, copper smelting would be the same, of course, green circuits, and red circuits. And then I set up a robot-based design of those same items. And these are builds from my maps. So the robot ones are from my sending supporters to space map, and the belt ones are from my tightening the belt map. I showcased both those bases and maps in episode 1, I believe. So let's get started here. And I'm showing this just to give you kind of a general idea of, what a build may look like. Because, if you're new to megabasing and such, you may not really be able to picture necessarily what a megabase build would look like. And you may be able to, and that's great if you can. Now, you can totally make up your own. You can grab some from the internet. There's, like Factorio Prints, I believe, is a blueprint site, and there's some others. If you want to just grab a build and use that, that is okay. I think for a learning process, making your own builds, or maybe downloading another build and then making your own based on the other one as inspiration is really good because it helps you learn the concepts. We will go through some concepts here. So let's look at the iron smelter to start with. Try to get off the belt here. And just quick note, these special build, these purple things, these are all from the creative mode mod. They're not actually part of the builds themselves in the blueprint. So the iron one, of course, is the simplest. We have ore going in, and then we have plate going out. Very standard process, just like normal iron smelting. However, the main difference here being is that we are using beacons and modules. And I discussed, kind of some builds with this, and also just the general strength and such of using beacons and modules in a previous episode. And with this, we are actually outputting 2 full belts of iron. We walk all the way down to the end here. These are some void sources here just to kind of consistently clear the belts. Now, we are outputting basically 2 full belts. I saw a gap or 2 here, maybe an inserter thing, although now I don't really see the gaps. But it's pretty straightforward. So we're using a little bit of, I wouldn't even call this belt weaving. I would say just creative use of undergrounds, if you could even call it that. And you can see they almost kind of mirror here. So we're inputting 2 ore belts, of course, and they run side by side, one directly in front of these inserters here on this first half of the build. So the build's kind of split in half. The first half grabs from this belt, and then the second half will grab from this underground stretch here. So in order to get both of these run, through the build, we are just kind of undergrounding here through these, and then once we get to the second half, the first line ends because it wouldn't really be able to support much past this, and then the second line starts, and it's basically just an exact copy of the first one. Same with the output, so we're outputting here, and now this build was built a long time ago, so it is entirely possible that some of this isn't working properly because it just maybe the mechanics were a little different back then. But basically what I'm doing is I'm forcing this onto the other side of the belt here. You'll see that this is initially outputting on the far side, and we're switching it here to the close side because we can't have all these placing on the same side because then we'd only have half a belt, and they wouldn't all work because it'd be backed up. So we're swapping sides here. So this is now put on the close side so that these guys can output on the far side because that's how inserters naturally output. And then it's kind of turned here and goes underneath just as the ore did, and then we have the same exact thing here, and we're left with 2 full output belts. Now this is an 8 beacon, so 8 beacons hitting every machine, speed beacons, of course, with productivity modules. So we are getting our productivity from this here, 20%. That's the most we can get from furnaces, and then beaconing it. And this is again a demonstration of the power of modules and beacons. We are getting 2 basically full belts of iron with this build. This is a very small build. Now, you may need multiple of these, and this depends entirely on your goal. So with these demonstrations, I'm going to try not to just tell you exactly like you need this or you need that, like specifically, because it depends on your goal. And we discussed goals, I think, in the first episode, whether you're launching X rockets per minute, or you just have a flat rocket goal, like I just want to launch 100 rockets in this time period generally, or you want to do X science per minute, which is the most common one. And so if you're going to say do 1,000 science per minute, and you use a calculator, which again I showed off in a previous episode, to figure out how much iron per minute you would need, then you can calculate this, figure out the build you use, how much it makes, and if it doesn't make enough all in one build, which is quite possible, you would need multiple of these. In my tightening the belt base, I was doing, I think, like 1.6k or 1.7k science per minute, and I had multiple of these. I had a whole row, multiple rows of these builds, all making iron, because I needed a ton of iron. Okay, and then copper would literally be the same exact thing. That's a nice thing, is once you make one, you can do the other and just obviously input different resources for the smelting. Now, circuits, again, similar type of deal. We have our inputs here, and then 8 beacons again here. You can see we are doing some different beacon spacing. This is due to the spacing of the assemblers, since they're not all directly up against each other like these smelters were. Then we have to kind of space our beacons, because if we were to just do a solid line of beacons, as we've done here, and the machines are not in a solid line, it will actually throw off the beacon coverage and make it so that these are not all 8 beacons. And that's not the worst thing in the world. You just have to keep that in mind when you're getting your final output calculation, that not all these are actually being hit by 8 beacons, or whatever the amount may be. Now, if you set up a build and that's the only thing running, like you have a test map and that's the only thing running, and you just look at production from that build, then it doesn't really matter what your beacon coverage is, because that build's just going to produce whatever it's producing. If that's the only thing you have running at the time, you can just get your production number from that pretty easily. But if you're actually calculating, like if you use a calculator and it says, you need this many green circuits per minute and this many machines to make it at this beacon coverage, which is what a lot of those calculators will do, you need to make sure you're actually using the beacon coverage and module setup you have in there. Otherwise, your numbers won't match up, and then your base will not run how you expect it to. So this is, again, I'm not going to go super in detail, but we attempted to make this as compact as possible. Now, yes, it probably could be slightly more compact, but we are, direct inserting where we can. We are using undergrounds to try to just reduce spacing and stuff, and kind of just, I wouldn't say belt weaving necessarily, just undergrounding where we can. So iron top 2, copper bottom 2. The iron on the top line, again, it's basically like the smelter in the fact that it's two different, it's like the first half and then the second half of the build. So this one supplies just this first section, and then this one actually goes to the second section. The bottom copper here supplies this first section. And you'll notice again, so it ends right here, and then the copper ends here. And then we just have the same type of deal here, and we're outputting almost 2 full green belts of circuits. Again, this build was made quite a long time ago, so some things change maybe that make it not run fully, or maybe for some reason I didn't make it run fully at the time. Like I said, it was several years ago I made this build. But I think it's still a decent example of generally a belt Megabase setup. And it's very possible you'll need multiple of these type of things. And I showed this off just to show kind of what a belt setup would look like and some ways to go about it. And the red circuit one is a very good example because it actually uses a different beacon setup. So there's 2 what I would say standard beacon setups, an 8 beacon setup and then a 12 beacon setup. And this one here is a 12. So it has the coverage of 12 beacons, and you'll notice instead of doing lines like this, they're actually kind of enclosed within a square. And my reasoning for doing this was, one, for speed, because red circuits obviously take longer, and hitting it with more speed beacons will make it faster. But also, it does allow, at least in my experience, it allows more room to work with running belts through and placing inserters, because, instead of just like basically one space above and one and two spaces below, or this little amount of space here, we have this entire square within these beacons to work things. We can underground underneath all the beacons, and then there's a straight path actually through this line right here where those beacons are spaced. And those beacons, again, are spaced for, to allow space, but then also for the coverage, to make them all fit properly. So the red circuit one is quite a bit more complicated, obviously requires quite a few more materials. It has pure plastic going in this top line, which feeds through, and you'll notice there's a splitter here, and then it splits it and sends it right above, and then it inserts. So this is just kind of a way to move the resources from this belt up one tile for each machine so the inserters can grab it. And then we have a mixed circuit and plastic line, which kind of just runs through here. It's not actually pulled from at the moment. And then we have copper here, which runs through all the way to the copper cable machines, which are down there. Pure circuits, and then pure copper. Again, circuits basically the same thing as plastic here, and then the copper just kind of runs straight through. So this is actually using something interesting where we're using belts going in two different directions, and this is an option, and this is something worth considering. If you have issues with placement or figuring out, like the order you can place things in, or just even belt room, then this is an option, because what we've done is we've actually put the cable machine like farther within the build rather than at the start of the build, and we're running the cable the opposite direction as all the other resources flow. And this is, this was just when I made the build, I just decided this was the best way to do it at the time for what I wanted. So the copper starts at the front and runs through, and then is grabbed by this machine and actually then output, and it's sent. This one actually happens to be sent two different directions. So it's output here and sent backwards for the machines before it, and then a little bit of it is output forward, or I shouldn't say a little, the same, half amount is output forward, and then some trickery here with side loading onto this belt, which then undergrounds the side load on this belt to basically get it on the other side for these to grab. So there was a lot of work that went into kind of brainstorming this build, and this is probably something you will have to go through, is a lot of trial and error, a lot of brainstorming if you make your own builds. Because I had to, we had to figure out, well, how do we get this on this side and have it go to these? Okay, well, we're going to side load, and then we're going to underground, and then come over here. And really, it seems overwhelming, but I think the best thing you can do is either look at a build and take some inspiration, like you could look at these or someone else's and take inspiration, but then just get in and start building. Like if you're wanting to build a Megabase, I would hope that you have a fair bit of game experience. You've at least maybe not necessarily launched a rocket, because I don't think that's a requirement necessarily, but you have, a decent amount of hours. You understand the game concepts, all right? Like you understand the game recipes, you understand at least to some degree the ratios in general, and stuff like that. So you can take that knowledge and then just start building. And that's I think the main thing, and this is where I struggled, and a lot of people struggle, is they're like, oh my gosh, I need this many things, I need this many machines, I don't even know where to start. Just start somewhere. Just start placing machines. Just be like, okay, just place your beacons first, and that's what I've done. This is how I came up with these builds, is I just place, like for this one, which is the most complicated, I just place my beacon squares, and then I was like, okay, I want a full belt of red circuits out of this build. And as you can see, this build is extremely long. It stretches across all of this, all the way to down here, and the output belts over there. So I figured out, okay, well, we need this many machines to get a full belt, so I need this many machines here. And I just started placing them. And then that's where you start figuring things out. I'm like, okay, well, red circuits take cable, plastic, and green circuits. How am I going to output these? Well, let's start from the front. We need plastic, obviously. We need green circuits. So let's get those in. Well, the cable, do I want to place the cable in the front or somewhere in between? Do I want to try to direct insert, which wouldn't really make sense because, one cable machine can supply many red circuit machines. And I was like, okay, well, maybe if we put it in the middle somewhere, but then how do we get the copper to it? And this was, I wasn't just like boom, 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 place these down, these belts. I'm like, okay, great, good to go. This took a lot of trial and error. Placing stuff, tearing stuff up, rearranging belts, tearing them up again, placing them entirely different. And eventually you will arrive at a build. And some people, like I find that fun. I find that a lot of fun. That's a lot of the appeal to me in the game. If you don't find that fun, if you just get really frustrated, then maybe your best bet is just importing someone else's build. If you want to go that route, you may not learn the concepts, but if you don't even find making the build very fun, I would still say the most important thing is have fun. So if you're not having fun making your own builds, I do advocate doing what you find most fun. So if you find it most fun to just grab someone else's build and then do the rest of the work in the map, like placing your rails and then placing the builds and making everything else work, go for it, But I just want to show you this as a demonstration. So we come down here and we have our output belt at the end there. Now I did mention spacing. Again, the belt builds are a little harder to tell than the robot builds, but I do, when I make my builds in Megabase form, I do try to make them as condensed as possible within the builds. So the builds themselves, I try to make very condensed because it saves on belts. In robot builds, I think it's even more important because it saves on robot travel time and the amount of robots you'll need to move the materials around. However, this is actually the opposite of what you want to do for spacing builds like between each other on the map. You actually want as much space as possible when placing builds on the map. And I'll show you kind of a bad example of this, like what not to do here shortly. Really quickly, just to touch on these bot builds, obviously not using belts. 8-beacon setup on all of these. I think even the red circuit one. Yeah, so 8-beacon setup on all these. And these are... I spent a lot of time trying to make these as compact as possible. They probably could be a little bit more compact. I'm sure some of you folks watching, will figure out ways you can make this more compact, which is awesome. But the reason for this is because it means less bot travel, and less bot travel means less charging potentially. It means less bots being used. So this iron smelter here, I believe this makes 24,000 iron a minute, this build here. We can't really look at production because we obviously have multiple iron builds running. It's using about 450 to 500 robots. We do have robot speed 8 done, which I researched. If you do use robots, you definitely would want to get several researches out of the way before trying to make your stuff. And a lot of care was taken to this. This build was actually very meticulously made. All the way down to the placement of the provider and requester chests to try to share chests as much as possible, because obviously if you can share chests instead of having 2 separate chests to achieve the same task, that's less locations the bots have to deliver to, which, again, same thing, it just makes less bot travel, less bot movement, and that's what you want. You want the least amount of movement as possible. Same with the requesters were placed to share when possible. You'll notice all the chests are on the close side, close to the trains, instead of like having this flipped where the chests are all up here where my mouse is running, or way up here, because that's farther from the train. Since the trains are in the center, that's farther the bots have to move. So you're kind of seeing the general concept here. Everything is made as compact as it can be, at least for my ability at the time. And then we have a circuit build really similar. One thing to point out is instead of just doing a straight line like this and such, it actually turned out to work better to kind of stagger them this way, just because it allowed for direct insertion a lot easier if you just built. So for something that needs direct insertion, like circuits, you couldn't really do that very easily if, this one here was cable and then this one here was circuits. You'll notice the difference. When we stagger it, we have this space where we can pass stuff through. If they're just on a line like this, you can't really do that. I mean, you can, but it requires an extra inserter, an extra chest. And again, that makes a difference for performance. The less bot movement and less inserters and less chests. All this is for performance reasons, for game performance reasons. Because if you're trying to build a mega base, you obviously want to try to stay at like 60 UPS, 60 FPS. Otherwise your game's gonna be running slow, and you're just gonna have a lot of problems. So you may be like, well, it's just one extra inserter. Well, when you multiply this within a build, and then you multiply by 3, 4, 5, 6 builds of this, you're saving like probably hundreds of inserters, which makes a difference. Throughout your whole map, if you take this concept and apply it through all your builds, you're saving probably thousands of inserters and thousands of chests or what have you. So just a note, you'll notice a lot of my builds have them staggered like this, and this is to allow like easy direct insertion through the chests. Again, the chests where the robots actually go are close to the trains, and then the wind chests, which don't require bots to go to them, are in the back. It's a 1-to-1 ratio I've set up here because with modules, productivity modules, it gets it close to a 1-to-1 ratio. And we have our delivery and our pickup. And then red circuits, again, very similar. This actually uses the similar-ish type of build to the smelters. It's a little different. So this cable machine is actually supplying 4 different machines here. You can see it's outputting, and then 2 grab it here, and it's outputting on the other side, and then 2 more grab it here. So every cable machine is supplying 4 of them, which I think is a fairly close ratio. The machine is actually still producing probably more than it needs to, obviously. Same concepts, just to kind of show you a general build of this, of how you could set this up. And you could certainly do these 12 beacons if you want. I just found for bot builds, I usually find 8 beacon setups to be easier because I don't need the room of a 12 beacon setup, right? I don't need the room to route all the belts through and stuff. I just need room to put chests and inserters and direct insert if possible. So I just personally prefer the 8 beacon, but you certainly can do 12 beacon if you find that easier to work with or have a cool build idea for that. You'll notice, so this build, now that it's evened out, this build is using about 800 robots, which is pretty good. This build, again, we can't fully look. I think this build makes about 6,000 or 8,000 red circuits a minute. So this is, pretty good. And, if you were to just haphazardly place a bunch of stuff, this would probably be using well over 1,000 robots or so. If the, things weren't taken into account, the precautions to make this super compact. So I hope this demonstrated how you can make builds kind of compact, some concepts to keep in mind, and why it is important to make them compact. The green circuit build uses about 500 robots, which is actually really low. This build produces a lot of circuits here. If I'm going to pull this up here off screen, and I have the stats here. So the green circuit build does about 31,000 green circuits a minute, is according to the stats I have here, which makes sense. This one only doing about 5,000 a minute. I think that makes sense. It's very small compared to this. So this does a lot. About 30,000 green circuits per minute for 5 to 600 bots. That's again, all these things taken into account to make it compact absolutely played into that. Now, train size in the build, that's entirely up to you. I can't really tell you what to use. I think that I think that it's just going to depend on what you like. Some people like using small trains and a bunch of them. Some people like using really huge trains and only a few of them. Obviously, the bigger trains, if you try to make a train that's like all your trains are like 12 wagons long, making a build around that could be challenging. It's going to make the build very big. And again, that poses some problems with bot travel or if you use belts, that's not as big of an issue, but it still is a consideration. There's a nice medium. Personally, I like 6, 8, maybe 10 cargo wagon trains at the most, personally. But you can certainly go smaller if you want. You can go bigger. It's just going to take some creative thinking. But I can't really just say use this train size because it's personal preference, really, I would say. So there's that. Now let's quickly hop into a map of showing some kind of bad examples of what to do when placing builds on the map, because this is when you actually need to take in the opposite concept of what I just explained. You want as much room as possible when placing builds on a map, because it's going to affect your trains, mostly your throughput. And this is my supplying Atlantis base, my stream base. And this base, to be fair, I mean, I made a lot of mistakes. Now, this was the first mega base I built in quite some time, and also I didn't have a solid goal. I wasn't doing, and I'm still playing this map. I'm not doing a X science per minute goal, or X rockets per minute. I'm doing a certain amount of stacks of every item, period, like not per minute, just generally, which is based amount of Twitch subscribers and stuff like that. Anyway, so I didn't have like, okay, I need this amount of resources per minute, because my goal was constantly changing, you know. So that's part of the reason this is very messy, because I just kept adding on builds and to the builds when I needed it. But I would still kind of advise against this. It's caused so many problems. There's still problems. It's running fairly smoothly now after a bunch of reworking. But even just looking at this, you can see these rails are quite the mess. I've done a lot of like kind of bootstrapping here to make this even remotely work. So here's an example. Where I'm standing, I'm in between two builds. Now this is a brand new red circuit build I haven't fully turned on yet. This is a red circuit build, the same build I just showed off, in fact. And I put the oil production to make the plastic for it right next to it, which I would not really recommend unless you have a very solid goal of like an amount you need to produce, so that the build you place here is going to be enough, and it will always be enough. For what I was doing, this was not a good idea, because I kept having to expand, and I ran out of rooms to reroute pipes. And I mean, you'll notice things are a complete mess, like with the pipes. There's no more room to build anything really here. And then, you know, I built the blue circuit build directly above it, which at the time seemed like a great idea, but we had to redo rails to try to make it so the trains can move between the builds properly, because I'm sending a red circuit train directly into the blue circuit build, but then also out to other builds elsewhere on the map. I mean, these rails are just what I would consider kind of a mess. There's quite a few problems here. And then the main thing is your train junctions, and this is what really caused problems. You'll look at, like, if you notice how close these train junctions are, for a mega base with a bunch of trains, especially larger trains, these junctions are much, much too close. Like, just way too close. I mean, this one, I don't even think you can fit one of my full trains in between this. And I think the absolute minimum, a kind of a rule of thumb, is the absolute minimum you should have between junction lines is enough room for your longest train to fit into. Like, if it stopped in between the junctions, it wouldn't be sticking out over either of the junctions. It would fit in between them. And that's like a bare minimum. I would say even more space than that. Because there's just so much, you know, again, right now it's working okay because we've done some shenanigans with circuits to make it only call trains when it needs to. That's kind of a whole different topic. But there was so much traffic coming in and out of here, going into builds, pulling out of builds, just traversing to get somewhere else. And it was just constant stop and go. We had massive traffic jams. And the thing is, with a rail network, if you have all one rail network, when you have a jam somewhere, it's probably going to affect the entire rest of your base. So, like, we would have a jam here, which would then in turn block this entire line. Even trains that aren't going to these builds would just completely stop, you know, because another train is stuck here and another train can't turn, and then it just blocks everything, and you get these massive gridlocks, which is definitely something you want to avoid. Now, kind of a caveat within this is, if you have builds of the same type, you could potentially place them closer. So this is an example of that with the green circuit builds. Again, same green circuit builds I just showed off. These are actually very close. In fact, they're like right next to each other without having the robot networks connect. And I've placed 4 of these. And I've done this type of concept multiple times on multiple maps, and it works. And the reason it works is because I still only have really one entrance and one exit to this. There's entrance now. Again, this was reworked, but there's entrances up top for the iron and copper to come in, and then another entrance for the green circuit trains to come in. But then all the other train movement is kind of within here, and they're all within separate builds. It's not like each one of these builds has its own connection to the main line, because then that would, of course, cause problems. But most of them, in fact, 3 of the 4, actually don't even go to the main line, period. They go directly, this is a direct connection over to this stacker, which is purely for red and blue circuits, because the blue circuits, of course, take so many green circuits. And then only one of these builds actually outputs its green circuit train onto the main network, right here. And this is another tactic you can employ, is if you have something that has a very high consumption amount, definitely consider doing just direct connections, like this. Instead of putting all these green circuit trains onto the network just to send them to a blue circuit build, if possible, maybe consider having it just a segregated line, just going directly to a blue circuit build, or whatever. It doesn't have to be blue circuits, but as an example. Or another thing you could do, which reduces trains, which I have done, is do on-site smelting. So I actually smelt the ore directly at the ore patch. It is mined into passive provider chests, which the robots then take, and the smelter is right here. And then we're just loading the plate onto a train. So this is eliminating, like this is cutting my plate ore transportation in half, because there's not any ore trains, period. Where, if you don't do this, then you're going to have ore trains and then also plate trains. And that can be done. I've done it on, I did it on my tightening the belt map. I did it on my sending supporters map. But this is an option to consider. As one last note to that, if you do have just central smelting and you do ore trains and plate trains, perhaps consider having those 2 networks separate, which is what I did on my sending supporters to space map. I had all the ore trains on a completely separate, segregated network from everything else. Now that took a lot of brainstorming and working to do, and it takes a lot of planning for your build placement. But if you have your ore trains on a totally separate train network than everything else, that can help a lot if you are able to actually do that. So that's something to consider as well. One last note on spacing here before we close out. This is green circuits. Down here is uranium processing. But let's hypothetically say this was just another, more high throughput build. Let's say this was like iron smelting here, or let's say this was red circuits or something. I would say this is more of a good spacing. So if we had green circuits, this line was not even here, let's imagine. And my next Megabase build was like over here. And let's say in this junction was here instead. So the only junctions we had was this one right here and this right here. This is more of the spacing that I would like. This would cause far less problems. Instead, I've placed like 4 different builds within that space, which is just so much closer than it should be. These builds should not even be here. If I were to redo this in a perfect world, these builds would just not even be here. Maybe one of them like over here, and it would connect on the top line instead, or just on the sideline. But having all of these here and all these connecting is just far too close. And this is something you really, really need to consider when placing your rail lines and placing your builds. The map, for all intents and purposes, is infinite. Obviously, the more map you reveal, the bigger file will be and all that. But there's not a huge penalty to spacing your builds out, aside from just having to travel a little farther and build more rails, which in the grand scheme of things on a Megabase are pretty cheap. So I would definitely just leave yourself, like if you look at it and you're like, okay, this is enough space, because this is what I thought initially. I was just like, oh yeah, sure, we'll build a red circuit build here. This is enough space. No, I would add even more, even double it. And that's not really going to cause you problems. It's only going to help you. You may have to add a few extra trains just to make up for the extra travel distance to get your throughput to where it needs to be, but that's still better than having things jammed in here. and having all kind of traffic problems. I'm having 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 junctions in the space of what I would really like to only have about 2 junctions, maybe 3 at the absolute most. So you can see that's a problem. And that's a case throughout the map. Everywhere it is basically that kind of problem. Like here, I would prefer these to not even be here. This junction and this junction. Or maybe one of them. Maybe like this junction, one in the middle, and then this one at the most. So definitely something to keep in mind there. I think that's going to close out the episode. I think we've been long enough. I hope that that gives you some ideas and inspiration for builds, and it sends through the concept of leaving space when placing builds, but kind of doing the exact opposite within your build and actually condensing it as much as possible. I hope that makes sense. I hope it's been helpful to you. If it has, a like is very much appreciated, as it helps me, know that you guys like the content, helps other people find it. If you have any questions or thoughts, please leave them below, and I will try to get the next episode out a bit sooner than I got this one out comparatively to the last one. I've just been extremely busy, so please forgive me there. But as always, thank you so much for watching. If you're new to the channel, feel free to subscribe as well to keep up with all the new content. And until next time, I look forward to seeing you all, and do take care.